you all set? You good to go? I'm going to start the introductions. Now, this is a little bit...
Someone that was started late.
Okay.
So,
I'll just do housekeeping stuff. But, this is slightly interactive, right? But I'm not going to say that to you. Okay.
it really is a format as people ask questions.
So I have to go introduce the next one, which is also starts at 4 o'clock, and then I have to go back to my booth. So I'll see you at the press conference afterwards. You guys can take care of your questions and answer them.
Is the video going to be a download or just a YouTube?
Yeah, I don't know this is a new video company for us, but I'm sure that we're going to be able to download it.
So I'm going to tell them to download the videos.
Yes, and
They
if
can
I
just sit
forget.
and listen. They don't really have to come.
Pretty much. And then we will post the presentation. I can mention that. You can emphasize it. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming to LEDucation 11. I'm Wendy Kaplan. I'm with Felix Lighting. I'm extremely excited to be able to introduce this presentation. Just a couple of housekeeping things. I know everybody had a hard time getting badges. We apologize. There was a glitch in the system. If you still don't have your badge and you need to get a CEU credit, when you do get your badge, just have them scan it. Or if you're not going to be able to get that done, just send us an email and we'll send you the CEU credit. When we send out the CEU credit, we're going to send a little reminder that there's a program evaluation form. It's really helpful for our speakers to get those forms back, so if you could go to the website and fill out the speaker evaluation form. We used to do it by paper, and I would end up carting home a couple 100 pounds of paper, and we've decided to save some trees this year and do it online, so please take a look at the form. If you want an AIA credit, you have to have your AIA number and just sign up for it outside. These presentations will be loaded onto the website shortly, and we're also videotaping these, and they will be loaded, and you'll be able to download everything, so Marty will address that a bit more. There are 2 halls upstairs, so be sure to visit the Americas Hall as well. There's some great manufacturers back there, and we're really happy that you were able to join LEDucation. This is your energy code questions answered, and we have an amazing panel. We have Marty Salzberg here. Marty, raise your hand. So Marty worked as an architectural lighting consultant for more than 30 years. Her work was honored with multiple industry awards for design and energy efficiency. As a member of the Illuminating Engineering Society, Marty has been a member of the Library Lighting Committee since 2003 and was recently appointed the chair. She's a professional member of the IALD, where she is an active member of the Energy and Sustainability Committee and serves as the IALD representative to the ASHRAE IES 90.1 Code Committee. Marty recently became a member of the Department of Energy Advisory Panel studying energy code compliance. Adam Kroll. Raise your hand. Obviously, he's the other person up here. Adam is currently a lighting designer at Cooley Minato Studio with a background in architectural engineering and previous employment with an MEP firm's lighting group. During 10 years of lighting-related work in New York City, Adam has navigated energy codes to meet sustainability and code criteria while also achieving design code goals. Adam has also been a part of the IES NYC Lighting 311 Committee, which has organized several education presentations about the continually evolving codes and standards that affect design. So without further ado, Marty and Adam, and thank you very much.
I just wanted to tell you, reinforcing what Wendy said, you will be able to download the slides from this lecture, and you will also be able to view a video of this lecture. So don't feel locked in taking copious notes. Sit back, relax. Okay?
Okay. So we titled this presentation called Your Energy Code Questions Answered. But this topic for us started with when the New York City Energy Code changed in the fall, and we had a lot of questions of our own. As we found the answers to our questions and reviewed the changes since the 2014 Energy Code, we wanted to share our findings with others. This will be available to download online for reference, as we all just said. So we'll begin with a brief overview of how the current code was developed. Last fall, the 2016 Energy Conservation Code of New York State was adopted, which was an update to the 2014 state code. This new code is based on the IECC 2015 and has the alternate path of ASHRAE 90.1 2013. So New York State took these national standards as the basis of their code, and then they made some changes. New York City has its own energy code, which needs to be stricter than the state code in order to be valid. So when the state updated their code, the city updated its code to take effect on the same day. The city started with the state's energy code and then made more changes to both paths of the code, the ICC path and the ASHRAE path. New York City has also passed local laws which are not part of the energy code, but they affect the energy use in buildings. And the city may also pass more local laws before the next major code update, which could affect energy use. So when you need to read the New York City Energy Code, which document do you want to look at? So New York City has compiled a book that includes all parts of the Energy Code with no supplemental documents needed. This is the book with the orange cover shown on screen. This book includes all of the chapters of the ICC-based path with the city's changes, and also includes the full text of the ASHRAE alternate path with the city changes to that. We don't recommend using the unmodified IECC or ASHRAE documents as a reference in New York City because of all the changes that the city made to them. The New York State has not published a consolidated book as far as we're aware, and so to follow that code, you do need to have the original IECC and ASHRAE documents and then a list of all the state's changes. And this is just one example of the city's changes to an ASHRAE lighting table that we marked up, showing you why you wouldn't want to use the unmodified document for reference in New York City. So where can you find the New York City Energy Code? You can browse it for free online. You can, of course, find it on the New York City Department of Buildings website, but we would recommend instead looking at the International Code Council's website, which is at codes.iccsafe.org. This website includes codes for many locations, including New York City. So clicking on the link for New York City brings you to a table of contents for the city's energy code. Each chapter in the code is a separate link that can be viewed, and all the changes that New York City made are included. It's not meant to be printed, but you can always take screenshots of those pages. So on screen now is a table of contents for the IECC-based path. And so the majority of that code's path's content, if you're doing commercial buildings, is under chapter C4. Scrolling down on the same table of contents on the website brings you to the chapters of ASHRAE as modified by New York City. And the main content of the code is buried under a confusing title. You have to click on the link that says Forward through 12 Normative References, which is hard to find and hard to say. So if you're looking for ASHRAE on the ICC website, remember to follow the link titled Forward through 12 Normative References. So why would we recommend using the ICC website instead of the New York City Department of Buildings? Because the ICC website shows where the city made changes to the base documents. And this is useful to know, especially if you also work on projects outside of the city. If you use the New York City DOB's website, that doesn't indicate where they made changes to the base documents. The New York City Energy Code can also be purchased as a hard copy from the New York City store. And if you're going to buy one code book and you do some work in the city, this one makes the most sense to own because it shows where the city made changes, just like the ICC website does. And therefore, if you use this reference for IECC or ASHRAE outside of the city, you'll be warned when you're looking at something that New York City changed.
They've made this a death trap over here, so we'll try not to kill ourselves as we do this. The New York City Energy Conservation Code 2016, so you found the code books, and now you have to decide which code path is the right one for your project. So we're going to do a little bit of a survey right now to see where people are at the beginning of this course. If you do energy analysis and you prefer using the IECC path, please raise your hands now. 2, 3. Keep them up, keep them up. 2. Okay, now keep your hands up if you raised it for the IECC path. Did you recently change your preference for which code path you use? Keep your hand up if you recently changed your preference. Got one person. Okay. If you prefer to use the ASHRAE path for code compliance, would you raise your hand? Okay, and if you recently changed to the ASHRAE path as your code preference, keep your hand up. All right, so it's pretty close. We had about 12 people that said they prefer the IECC path and about 16 or 18 that said they prefer the ASHRAE path. The most important thing is for the project team to sit down together at the beginning of the project and understand the ramifications of which code compliance path you decide to choose, because there are really issues with each path and how it affects your project. So for 2016, there are changes in both paths that make them closer to equivalent. The lighting power allowances for IECC and ASHRAE are very similar because IECC now has the space-by-space allowance or method and a decorative allowance. Previously, earlier codes, some buildings or space types had a little decorative allowance built into them, into the overall LPD. And now there are only a few space types that have a different allowance. And where New York City reduced allowances, like retail and offices, they're identical now. New York City made further modifications in both codes, and one area where they modified it is voltage drop. Many engineers found the voltage drop requirements in ASHRAE problematic. In New York City, now both compliance paths reference the National Electric Code, so that difference has been eliminated. Dwelling units in high-rise residential are not exempt in New York City when using the ASHRAE compliance path. It's not a lighting power allowance, it's efficiency, and this modification, if you don't know, was introduced in the recent previous path in 2014. And the landmark exemptions law in both compliance paths are the same. That's because New York State has a landmark exemptions law. State law prevails over energy code. And please note that buildings that are only locally listed in New York City are not exempt. And new in IECC 2015, what we're calling the New York City at IECC compliance path, if you're working outside New York City and outside New York State, in IECC, historic buildings are not automatically exempt. So you need to prove that you need the exemption if you use the IECC path outside the city. For alterations, IECC has a threshold of 50% of fixtures. ASHRAE has a threshold of 10% of connected lighting load. New York City equalized this at 20%. So in general, the modifications that New York City made to the 2016 Energy Code help align the codes and reduce confusion. Now, there are several project types that require the use of the ASHRAE compliance path. If the project is going to seek LEED certification, the project must use the ASHRAE path or do extra work, and good luck getting paid for that. New York City has a new local law, Local Law 31 of 2016, for design of city-owned or funded projects, and it references ASHRAE 90.1 2013 as the base code. So you have to use the ASHRAE path for these projects. If you're working on these city projects and are not aware of Local Law 31, we have a link at the end of the presentation for more information. I think it goes into effect in 2018. If the project will require modeling for the total building performance path, using trade-offs between building components, New York City will only accept ASHRAE. So when do I think the IEC path is the one to choose? If you want the simple, straightforward, quickest, easiest way for building compliance, and you're doing the building area modeling path, the building area method, you might choose the IEC path. Both codes have the building area method, but the IECC path usually has fewer control requirements. And as I said, using IECC for the space-by-space method is more viable now that IECC has the decorative allowance. Space-by-space was only added to IECC in the most recent previous code cycle that we used for 1 year here in New York. So now they've got space-by-space and decorative, it's come a long way. So here are a couple of project-specific reasons you might choose IECC. When the project is new construction for a space type that would require skylights, we'll talk more about skylights later, the IECC path has an exemption for spaces that use less than 1/2 watt per square foot for general lighting. If the design can be tailored to be below that threshold, then skylights would not be required in the building, and that would save a lot on construction costs. IECC also has a light reduction exception for spaces using one fixture of less than 100 watts. So with LED linear fixtures, this could exempt a lot of spaces from the light reduction requirement. Now, so there may be other project types that are project-specific reasons to choose IECC. Now, IECC has an exception to the requirement for daylight responsive controls on the ground floor of certain hospitality and retail spaces. The exception is for side lighting, not for daylight zones under skylights. ASHRAE does not have the exception for hospitality spaces. And you might choose the New York City IECC path to avoid the additional control requirements in ASHRAE, including automatically switched outlets in 6 spaces, partial automatic off, or because of the secondary side light daylight zones in ASHRAE that could double the size of the daylight responsive areas in some projects. ASHRAE also has separate control requirements for parking structures that include occupancy sensors and daylight responsive controls. If your project has a large parking structure, the IECC path might be the better path for you. So this is the avoidance list of things you might want to avoid and want to choose the IECC path. And because New York City Energy Conservation Code is based on IECC 2015, the most thorough ComCheck software was developed accordingly. Adam will provide some guidance on ComCheck at the end of this class, so you'll see more how that works. So when is ASHRAE the path to choose? It might be just based on familiarity. I'm more familiar with the ASHRAE path. You may have noticed I'm on the ASHRAE committee. So I've preferred it for years. So learning new elements in this standard are easier for me. The same might be true if you've always used the IECC path. When there's a change, it's easier to figure out what changed than the one you're more familiar with. ASHRAE still has more flexibility for the designer because of the 20% room cavity ratio adder and the additional power allowances for control factors, particularly if your project involves upgrades of only a few spaces like building lobbies and corridors. You may need these additional power allowances. And this type of work is becoming more common in New York City with the looming deadline of Plan NYC in 2025. When this law was passed 8, 10 years ago, 2025 seemed really far away. It's 8 years. ASHRAE has 2 allowances for site projects that IEC does not. One is for landscape, useful for planters and lawn areas, even though lawns aren't really very common in New York City. And the second allowance found only in ASHRAE is for loading docks, and it's a reasonable 1/2 watt per square foot. Now, there are several project-specific types where ASHRAE is more generous. In retail sales, the ASHRAE display adder has a higher initial boost of 1,000 watts, where IECC is 500 watts. This is helpful for small stores. It's not based on square footage. You're doing retail display lighting, you get this adder. ASHRAE does not require daylight responsive controls for side light daylight zones on any floor of a retail project, whereas I mentioned previously, IECC exempts it on the first floor. Additionally, New York City amended ASHRAE to eliminate the requirement for daylight responsive controls in retail sales area under skylights, but they didn't make that change in the IECC path. So for all these reasons, that retail projects might benefit from using the ASHRAE path. Now, ASHRAE exempts the lighting required for television broadcast in sports activity areas. IECC only exempts the lighting for professional sports facilities, handicapping college sports projects. Seems to me there's a lot of televised college sports. And IECC has an exemption for plant growth and maintenance. ASHRAE extended the exemption to non-human life forms. And so when the project's a research laboratory, animal shelter, or a zoo, lighting needed for the animals, and even insect research is exempt. These are project types I dealt with regularly in my design career, so I'm familiar with the preferred ASHRAE solution. You might find others. But I'll tell you, in my opinion, avoiding the IECC additional efficiency options may be the most important reason the designer chooses the ASHRAE compliance path. IECC has additional efficiency options that aren't really options. One of them must be selected for each project. 2 of the 6 options are lighting related. The project-specific option might not be selected before your contract is finalized. If the project team selects a lighting efficiency option, it will require additional work for the designer and the engineer in terms of design and documentation. So while Adam explains the code further, you might find other deciders.
So what are some of the changes in the New York City Energy Code between 2014 and the new 2016 version? So the power densities for general lighting have decreased for most spaces for both the IECC and ASHRAE paths. These reductions are based on the light level criteria from the IES that they published from 2010 to 2012. And these are based on real models of spaces that used fixtures from that period in time. At the time, those predominant market use of fixtures were fluorescent, compact fluorescent, metal halide, almost no LEDs. And the graph on this slide shows Department of Energy LED downlight efficacy data over time. So since 2010, LEDs have become a lot more efficient, and when they were basically on par with metal halide and compact fluorescent at the time, now they're much more efficient. And so therefore, the power densities that these models were based on in 2010 should be easier to meet now using modern LEDs. And as a requirement and a change in this new code, this reduction in power density allowance is pretty easy for us to understand, because this usually happens with each energy code update. So in our opinion, the real challenge of the new code is with the controls, so both in the understanding of what the code requires and then in implementing those designs. So the 2 paths within the New York City Energy Code, the IECC-based and ASHRAE-based, are closer than before in terms of the lighting requirements. The New York City amendments also have been pushing the 2 paths closer together by making the same changes to both of them. So the power density allowances for spaces are now the same, except for just a few exceptions. Those are shown on screen. A big change to the IECC path is the introduction of the decorative allowance of 1 watt per square foot, which is for the space-by-space method calculation. And in previous versions of the code, this was only available in the ASHRAE path. And as a reminder, the decorative lighting allowance can be applied to more than just chandeliers and sconces, which makes it very useful in a variety of space types. So decorative lighting includes fixtures that highlight special finishes and other lighting effects such as ceiling coves, which are meant to set the mood of a space. So in this photo, the coves and the backlit glass could be considered decorative lighting if they're controlled separately from the general lighting and the downlights. So in this code update is the first time that the city changed individual power density values. And so they have reduced the power densities of offices and retail, which are pretty widely used space types. So you have to be careful when you're looking at the power density tables in IECC and ASHRAE documents that don't have the city changes included. And as Marty just explained with the additional efficiency option in IECC, there's now a couple extra options added onto this. And so now instead of 4, there's 6 options, and 2 of which involve lighting. The feedback that we received indicates that the reduced lighting power option will still be a pretty likely path because people think that this doesn't add as much cost to the construction as some of the other options. And so this reduced lighting power option is a 10% lower allowance for lighting. But the good news this time is that this is more flexible than in the 2014 code. Because this, even when you choose this option, you're still now allowed to use the space-by-space calculation, which lets you use decorative lighting allowances, and it still lets you use retail lighting allowances. You just have to reduce those by 10% as well. Whereas in the last code, you had to use the building method, and so you didn't have these extra allowances. And then the other option that involves lighting is about lighting controls. And it basically requires digitally addressable controls for most of the light fixtures on a project. And so due to this cost of that, it would be unlikely just to jump into that, just to meet that requirement. But if a digital lighting control system is already planned on a project, then that could have the added bonus of possibly meeting this requirement. And there's been a change to the exterior facade lighting allowance on the IECC path. The language for the facade allowance has been rewritten, reducing the watts per square foot allowance, and also changing how it's defined. So the IECC now clearly states that the entire surface area of the building can be used in calculating allowances for facade lighting. So there's no longer an option for taking the perimeter of the building base of the footprint. And so with this example on screen, the full facade area can be used towards the allowance, even if you've only illuminated the top of the building. And then although the ASHRAE wording and allowance, they haven't changed since the last version of the code, there is an ASHRAE formal interpretation that confirms that you can use the entire facade area. And the difference between the IECC and ASHRAE with this could arise with a facade that can't reasonably be illuminated. If, for example, you have a wall that faces an alley that's only a few feet from the next building, the IECC would let you count this unlit wall area towards the allowance, where ASHRAE wouldn't. And just as a reminder, so how are the exterior lighting zones defined in New York City? So these LZ lighting zones are determined by the land use zoning districts. And this is outlined in this, there's a rules document, RCNY 5001. And this is a document that has a lot of information about energy code compliance and supplemental information. And so we'll go through a quick example just at this hotel's address to show how it's found. And so there's a tool on the nyc.gov website called ZOLA for land use zoning information. And you can enter an address to look up the zoning. You can also browse maps that have the zoning overlaid. And so with this hotel's address comes up as zoning C6-6, which corresponds to lighting zone 4, and that's the brightest allowance allowed. But you shouldn't assume that all of Manhattan is zone 4. A lot of residential areas in Manhattan are even zone 2, which is shown on the orange on this map, and those have a pretty low exterior lighting allowance. And you can also see that it varies really block by block. So we're going to talk more about controls.
So Adam highlighted the general changes, and as we've said, Since both IECC and ASHRAE reorganized the control section of the codes, we feel that these are the changes that impact our work the most. For IECC, the effort included reorganization and additional stringency. For both, the intent was to make it easier to understand the requirements. ASHRAE organizes the control section by function, and IECC, New York Energy Conservation Code, is organized by device and then function. So the ASHRAE list on the left looks significantly longer, but it's broken down into more functions. Here's the first page of the New York City IECC control section that starts with occupancy sensors. All spaces require either an occupancy sensor or a time switch control and may require additional controls. If your space type is on this list for occupancy sensors without any exceptions, you can actually skip the section on time switch control. New York City added the requirement for occupancy sensors in open plan offices highlighted at the bottom, and the occupancy sensor controls section in the code includes where to use the device and the functional features. So these are the paragraphs describing functional requirements and the exceptions for occupancy sensors and the New York City changes, which really added complexity. I had to make a spreadsheet to understand. On the left are the IECC requirements at the New York State level compared to here in New York City, shown on the right. New York City requires that occupancy sensors turn off the lights after 20 minutes, where IECC sets the timeout at 30 minutes. 20 minutes is consistent with the ASHRAE timeout. Because of New York City Local Law 48, 4 space types highlighted in green on the right-hand side require manual on occupancy sensors, sometimes called vacancy sensors. Now, New York City added preschool classrooms to the exceptions for spaces that require manual on sensors. That's at the very bottom of the page. And even though New York City requires occupancy sensors in open offices, those sensors can be full automatic on. With occupancy sensors required in so many spaces came the realization that some projects might have only a few other space types. So another control system really wouldn't be cost effective. If you choose to use occupancy sensors in one of these optional spaces on the screen, they may be full-on sensors. For all other space types, move on to the time switch, light reduction, and manual control requirements. But remember, spaces may also require daylight responsive controls. I was recently asked about light reduction and occupancy sensors in stairs. While both are allowed in stairways and paths of egress in New York City, Local Law 47 does not allow the lights to be turned off 100% if the building has any occupants. ASHRAE took a different approach to reorganization, choosing to add the control requirements to the space-by-space lighting power allowance table, little excerpt here. This allows the specifier to find the control requirements for each space type contiguous to the LPD. Now, New York City added the same complications to the ASHRAE path as the IECC path regarding Local Law 48 and open plan offices. The New York City changes in the table are not readily apparent because the entire table is annotated with the New York City modifications in the indicator that's in the margins. So if you just want an example, refer back to the one that Adam showed earlier in the slides. The highlighted LPDs are the office ones that New York City reduced. Columns A, B, C, et cetera, right here, reference the code paragraphs. After finding the control requirements for the space type here in the LPD table, read the corresponding code paragraph. ASHRAE is device neutral for many of the functions. You'll notice that the word occupancy sensors doesn't actually appear in the standard. For bi-level controls, the intermediate step in ASHRAE has a range, so the project can have a 1/3, 2/3 setting instead of the 50% in IECC. Columns B and C, let's see if I can make, columns B and C tell us how to turn the lights on, indicating either manual on or partial automatic on control. If both columns are labeled add 1, as in the enclosed office of 250 square feet, larger than 250 square feet, the specifier must choose 1. If one of these two columns is labeled required, then there's no choice, and the other column should be blank. But I've marked up the New York City thing here because local law 48 is written that manual occupancy sensors are required in offices of 200 square feet or less, but ASHRAE sets the square footage at 250 feet. So I'm trying to figure out, I think New York City is indicating for offices of 201 to 250, the specifier can choose manual on or partial automatic on. It doesn't really make sense to have required in column B and an add 1 in column C. Leaving both columns B and C blank would indicate that a full-on device is allowed, but is currently labeled for open plan in the ASHRAE path. New York City is requiring partial on devices, but as I said earlier, in the IECC path, it's full on, so it's interesting. Previously, IECC only required daylight zones to be separately controlled but not automatically responsive. Both codes now require automatic daylight responsive controls when other conditions are met. So IECC requires the daylight responsive controls to provide continuous dimming for offices, classrooms, laboratories, and library reading rooms. Now, since the daylight control requirements are more stringent in this code cycle, we're going to cover these more thoroughly in a few minutes with an example. Columns H and I, over here, tell us how to turn the lights off and really tell the specifier what type of device is required. If column H for full automatic off is labeled required, then we know that a device that senses vacancy with a 20-minute timeout is required. Where column H and I are labeled add to, there's a choice between a vacancy sensor and a device that has scheduled off. Now, with both types of devices or systems, there are exceptions, notably for safety and security. The only space type in ASHRAE that requires full scheduled shutoff is a parking garage, but ASHRAE, as I mentioned before, has additional controls. Partial automatic light reduction set at 30% and is required to have control zones of no larger than 3,600 square feet. Light reduction is not required for IECC for spaces like parking that use less than 0.6 watts per square foot. Daylight transition zones in ASHRAE have to be separately controlled from the general illumination, and any additional lighting for the daylight transition eye adaptation has to be automatically reduced during sunset to sunrise hours. And remember, in ASHRAE, the daylight transition lighting is an exception from the lighting power allowance. In ASHRAE, the definition of a daylight zone for parking garage covers a larger area. That's the 20 feet of the perimeter. And that's not the same as other interior spaces. The IEC definition is constant. As Adam mentioned, the facade lighting allowances are very similar because IECC adopted a lot of those allowances. The control strategies are also similar. This now includes a requirement that facade and landscape lighting be turned off at some time. ASHRAE says the lights have to be turned off between midnight or building closing, whichever is later, and 6 a.m. or building opening, whichever is earlier. Both paths also have a late night light reduction requirement for all the other lights. IECC is a little bit more stringent because it doesn't have these qualifying phrases in ASHRAE, whichever is later, whichever is earlier. In IECC, landscape and facade lighting must be turned off based on scheduled opening and closing times. So now we're going to go into more depth on skylights and daylight controls.
So I was surprised to find in this code that there's some requirements for when skylights are mandatory. And so this is found in the building envelope chapters for minimum skylight fenestration, and it's not under the electric lighting portions. So why should a lighting designer or an engineer, if you're hired to do electric lighting, why would you be concerned about this requirement? It's because the consultant responsible for this effort needs to be identified at the start of the project, because even figuring out if skylights are needed will take some work. And if this requirement gets missed early in design, this could mean a lot of redesign later in the project. So we'll walk through an example of an office space that illustrates the skylight and daylight responsive control requirements. And to start reviewing whether skylights are required, the first item on the list is obvious, which needs to be below it, directly below a roof. And then the other requirement is that it needs to have a ceiling over 15 feet. So in our example, this floor shaded in purple meets this requirement. And so these first two items will make this requirement kind of rare in Manhattan, but you have to remember that this code applies to all 5 boroughs in New York. And this is something that's in the base IECC and ASHRAE codes. So this holds true in New York State and anywhere else where those codes are used. And so the space has to be greater than 2,500 square feet. And then the fourth item is it has to be of a particular space types. And there's a list in ASHRAE and there's a list in IECC. The list in ASHRAE is a little bit longer. And so in our example, an office space is one of the categories on the list that might require skylights. But before you conclude that you need skylights, first you also need to go through a list of exceptions. And the first one's for cold climates, which is not New York City. And the second one is for obstructions. If there's another building that obstructs your building or some natural feature, you don't need to put in a skylight. However, you do need to document that this obstruction exists, and the code defines how you need to document this and what qualifies as an obstruction. I think this would meet the obstruction. And so a question about this is, could the taller portion of the same building be considered as an obstruction to a floor below for skylights? And in the IECC-based path, the answer is yes. But in the ASHRAE path, doesn't allow a taller portion of the same building to be considered an obstruction to a lower portion of that building. But then even though ASHRAE may require a skylight in that case, in the electric lighting sections, it defines the obstructions differently, and so you might not need any daylight responsive controls for your mandatory skylight. And so if you have roof monitors, that's just an acceptable alternative to skylights, and you still need daylight control for the lighting underneath them. And then also, you can subtract the side light area from the windows from your enclosed space area that we figured out was 2,500 square feet or greater. And then the way that ASHRAE and IECC define the side light areas are a little bit different. And then this is just in the IECC path. If you have a lighting power density less than half a watt per square foot, then you don't need skylights in that space. So maybe in this, this half watt per square foot is feasible now for an office if you use task lighting and efficient LEDs. I think I'm getting a little low on time, so I'm going to skip a few of these where we go over how to size and locate the skylights, and we're going to skip to just how the daylighting is controlled underneath them.
So You'll have this to reference, and you'll know where skylights are required. We've also provided a list at the end of where skylights are required. So how do we determine where daylight responsive controls are required? ASHRAE, you look at the table, and it's indicated in the table, columns E and F tell you where daylight responsive controls are required. And in IECC, all space types except those that are on the list of exceptions, which are showing here on the screen, may require daylight controls. And remember always, daylight responsive controls apply to general lighting only, the general lighting located with side lighting and top lighting. Both ASHRAE and IECC use the height of the vertical fenestration. We'll call this the window for the depth of the daylight zone, but there are differences in what constitutes an obstruction and how the width of the daylight zone is calculated next to the window. The width is half the height in ASHRAE, but fixed at 2 feet beyond the windows in IECC, so you need to verify this based on which code path you're using. Only ASHRAE has the secondary side-lighted zone, which replicates the depth of the primary zone unless there's an obstruction. In the example space, we've determined that all the highlighted spaces could be daylight zones based on the window size, the transmittance, and the exterior obstructions. So now we have to move on to the watts in each space. Here's the proposed lighting layout. And here's an overlay with the potential daylight zones. And when using the ASHRAE compliance path, you have to determine the watts of the general illumination in both the primary and secondary daylight zones, 150 watts for primary or 300 for primary plus secondary. And decorative and task lighting are excluded in the office project. In a retail project, retail display would be excluded. In a top lighting area where there's daylight from skylights, again, the general lighting has to be 150 watts or greater to require daylight responsive controls. Lighting in overlapping areas of top light and side light should be controlled together with the skylight zone fixtures. So in our example, 2 of the smaller spaces using the ASHRAE path do not require daylight responsive lighting because the wattage of the general lighting is less than 150 watts in the primary side light area or less than 300 watts in the primary plus secondary areas. In this example, there would be 6 automatic daylight responsive zones plus other controls required.
So in the IECC-based path, the idea is the same, but the way that the daylight zones are defined is different, and there are no secondary daylight zones. So for this example, we simply verify that each primary daylight zone, both from the skylight and from the windows, we make sure that it has more than 150 watts. And then the only complication with this code path is that the requirement that the side lighting from different cardinal directions be controlled separately. With an exception for less than 150 watts. So if that corner office faces north and east, then the lighting on those 2 sides would have to be different daylight zones, or ASHRAE doesn't require that. And so in this example, this brings us to 4 separate daylight zones that require automatic daylight control. And note that one of those small rooms at the bottom was considered a daylight zone in ASHRAE, but in this example, the way that the small windows work, the daylight zone only extends 2 feet past the sides of the window instead of ASHRAE's full half the head height. So one of the daylight zones doesn't have 150 watts in it anymore, and therefore that room doesn't need daylight responsive control. So with comparing the 2 paths, the ASHRAE path results in 6 separate daylight zones, and the IECC path results in 4. So what do you have to file with the DOB? So the supporting documentation for daylighting zones is needed when you file for energy code compliance. And specifically, locations of daylight zones need to be shown on floor plans. And another question about this is, can the daylight control requirements vary on different floors of the same building? And so in this example, we've drawn in another building adjacent that's not quite as tall as our building. So in this example, the lower floor might be obstructed by that building, and so it might not require the same daylight responsive controls as the top floor. And so it could be a lot of work to document the different obstructions conditions on each floor and on each direction. And then we want to go over CompCheck because of something important in here about the ASHRAE method. And so in the latest software version of CompCheck and also the web CompCheck, there is you can see in the pull-down code menus, there's an option for 2016 New York City Energy Code. And this is the IECC 2015 based path. But you have to be aware that the CompCheck reports can only demonstrate compliance with this path. And if you're doing the ASHRAE path, some of the space types won't be correct. So to show the compliance in the IECC-based path, you just have to choose the 2016 from the menu. And then you also have to choose, if you have a new building, you have to choose the C406 additional efficiency option because this is going to affect your watts per square foot allowances. And this is a similar process in the web CompCheck. But if you're doing the ASHRAE path, you can find ASHRAE 2013 in the list of codes in CompCheck, but this is not the one that New York City changed. This is just the base ASHRAE 90.1 2013. So if you fill out a CompCheck report that uses ASHRAE, the DOB's advice after we asked them about what to do is that you should use the tabular method on the energy filing drawings to show any New York City requirements that are reported incorrectly by CompCheck. So CompCheck is just a reporting tool. It's by no means going to be correct, is what they're kind of implying. And just one thing to know on CompCheck is that you have to turn on, under the options, the allowances and exemptions. This is a pretty common question. They're turned off by default, and it's kind of hard to find, but you should turn them back on. And there's a checkbox in the web CompCheck also for this. And so we're at the end of this part of the presentation, and we want to spend the rest of the time answering some questions. And then this is just some links that you can access once you download this. And so, are there any questions from the audience now?
So we don't really use Beekman in New York City, but we're in New York. So I'm kind of confused. Like, I guess I didn't realize that we could pick a path. Like, I thought we could follow.
In New York State, it would be, yeah, there is still two paths. It's
In the first paragraph, it says you will use either ASHRAE or the requirements in this code book for IECC. So you always have the choice between an ASHRAE or an IECC compliance path. I think that only states like California and Washington that have their own code don't give you that choice. More states adopt IECC, but the language in IECC always allows the ASHRAE option.
Oh, okay. So then it's just your team decides which way to go. And if
Right.
you do leave, you do that.
Right.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the team may have already decided long before you were involved what they were doing, and even which of the additional efficiency options they're doing. So you might not have a say in that, but then you have to know what they're doing then in that case.
Sometimes it's best to call the building department official and confirm if ASHRAE equivalent is allowed and what's their latest code, because sometimes it's not always updated, like depending on the state that you're working in, the county.
Right. If you go to the website energycode.gov, there's a map provided there that shows you what code is current in each state.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but they may not always keep it up to date, and you have to like look into what's effective, which code is effective from when, because if they adopt a new code, they don't always update the website. That's what I've noticed from my experience, so it could not apply.
Right. So talking to
There is a lag of a couple of months sometimes, but I noticed something recently that they're starting to say the new code is in development. They are tagging it depend, so that you know if you're working on a new project, you might want to just jump to the new code, because you could finish all of your work, and then by the time you submit to the Department of Buildings, the code has changed, so yeah, so you should always find out if there's another code in development.
Regarding high-level lighting and stairways, it looked like you said the minimum lighting could be 30 to 70%. I thought it was a couple of foot candles that were required.
No, in New York City, because of local law 47, the stair lighting cannot go below local law 47, which I think is 2-foot candles. There's a 1-foot candle and a 2-foot candle, and it says paths of egress, corridors, stairs, things like that. So you can have bi-level, but you have to design it to a higher light level to switch it down when the stair is not occupied to 2-foot candles. And that's a minimum, not an average. Yes?
Where people have the phosphorescent tape in the stairwells and they have the bi-level lighting,
Mm-hmm.
there's often a concern about the bi-level lighting charging the tape.
Right.
Does 2-foot candles charge the tape?
Yeah, there's someone on the ASHRAE committee who has confirmed that the bi-level tape will be charged by 2-foot candles, yes. But I'm not a code official, and as a designer, I never designed stairs to only 4-foot candles. I tried to always design stairs to a higher light level than that, because I was around for the first World Trade Center bombing where the lights all failed in the stairs, so I feel really responsible in making sure there's always enough light in the stairs, good days, bad days. So you can do bi-level, and it should charge the tape. So if you're interested, we did get some questions that were submitted in advance. Does anybody else have questions here in the room? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, you know the local law you mentioned about the city requiring ASHRAE 90.1, does that apply to HPD funded projects? You know, it's over a longer list of
To what?
HPD funded projects.
If it's a city-funded project or a city-owned building, it applies. So I think yes. The phrasing is odd. It's significant city funding, and then there are reams of paragraphs on if it gets this much money and that much money, and so the city doesn't keep it simple. So we prepared a couple of other, people ask us all the time about code questions, so we have a couple of other examples to show you.
Sure. So one question is about just what kind of lighting controls are required in a public corridor, or maybe a lobby. We'll talk about a corridor, and so, you know, the code requires local controls, but that doesn't make a lot of sense in a public lobby. So, so there is an exemption you can use to avoid local controls, which would be safety, and it can be unsafe to walk into an unfamiliar dark space and not know where the on switch is, like for example in like a hotel corridor, and so this is also, yeah. So. And so for the same reason as the local law 47, also in these spaces, also I'll say that you allow you not to turn the lights off if you need to leave them on for
Have you ever been in a hotel in Europe? It was more than 20 years ago, the first time I was in a hotel in Europe where the corridor lights were off, and you stepped out of the elevator and the lights came on by occupancy sensor.
Yeah.
And you can't do that in New York City because they don't allow a building that's occupied to be completely dark.
But what could happen is you could have the automatic partial off in a corridor. So if you have a brightly lit corridor, and then if you do reduce it down to the 50% output, if you're still above the egress levels, then you should have the motion sensors to automatically turn off the lighting to that level in a corridor as the partial off.
I have a question. Like, if there is a vestibule that's, and you enter into the reception area, is that vestibule considered a corridor of certain width, or is it considered like a reception lobby? Like, in terms of space, like, because there is no vestibule to set up.
Depends on what lighting power allowance you need for the project.
That's smart.
Sorry.
one more thing about the corridor that we forgot to mention is that even though you may not need to have this local control in there, the code does say that you need a remote control somewhere. So a switch somewhere else secure that is labeled for that, or some control system that can then turn off that area from a safe place. And then I think the vestibule question relates to perhaps this question that we had.
Can we go back to the others? I don't know that the vestibule question.
Well, just about which space type is something if there's
Oh.
no obvious category.
Yeah, so the energy codes say, if on the space type allowances, there's no space type that specifically is your space type, to select the one that is most like your space type. But I got a question recently about what do we do about queuing for security and security screening areas? Well, there's absolutely nothing in the lighting power allowances that really equates to this. And even though this is a Port Authority project here in New York, Port Authority often says, use the lighting power allowance or use the energy code of New York if at all possible. But there's no allowance for this space type. So I really am very open to people sending me their questions and sending me their problems, because we're already working on the 2019 code, and it just makes the code better if people say to me, well, what about this space type? What can we do for this space type? Or any questions like that. You want to go back? So does everybody understand that building area method?
Oh, sure. Bill.
Yeah. So the building area method is not a whole building system, and that when you have a building with multiple uses, you're supposed to break down the building by area types. So it's sort of space by space light, because you have much bigger areas. So after you figure out the LPD for each of these building areas, just like in space by space, the allowances are tradable. And the only time it's not is if there's a separate permit. So this is a typical New York City example where the two ground levels might be retail, and that's a future tenant space. Somebody actually asked me, well, can't I take the allowance for that retail space and use it in the rest of the building? I said, no, you need that for the retail space. If it's actually being built out as part of your single permit, then you can trade it, but otherwise not. But remember, if you use the building area method, there's no additional allowances for retail spaces or decorative lighting. So you want to would you mind advancing it? I was also asked, how do I determine the allowance for a bridge? So in this example, the bridge is in a park, and it's not part of a building project. So the answer is, this type of bridge is not covered because it's not part of a building. There's no energy code requirement for this bridge. And the next one. Does everybody understand what's a residential? We didn't talk about residential at all, and IECC had, and that's because ASHRAE doesn't really have a residential section. IECC has a full residential section. But in the fall, New York City passed Local Law 134 of 2016, and I was asked, how does the layperson understand what types of buildings this applies to? And the answer is, code language is rarely easy for the layperson to understand.
And so that local law requires buildings
Right,
of a certain size to be brought to code by 2025?
Right, and it lowered the threshold of what buildings have to be brought to code. It lowered it from the 50,000 that we've here in New York been thinking about for 2025 to 25,000 square feet. It didn't change the end date of 2025. So there's an exception for real property not more than 3 stories above grade, and that's really the magic phrase. 3 stories above grade is what separates commercial from residential. And this also aligns with ASHRAE. You probably saw The ASHRAE code says energy standard for buildings except low-rise residential buildings. So low-rise residential is everything not more than 3 stories above grade. So this is a picture, go back one, sorry. So this is a picture of residential. These types of buildings, these type of residences don't have to comply with local law 134. And the next one. And these buildings are considered commercial buildings. They're all greater than 3 stories above grade. So public common areas and non-dwelling unit areas, typical in New York City, something on the ground floor might be rented to a doctor. All those spaces are considered commercial spaces. So these areas of Mayor Bloomberg's house and even a massive apartment building like the Dakota will require upgrades by 2025. And 432 Park Avenue is a new building, and as long as the design is in compliance with the code, in effect July 2010, then the buildings don't have to upgrade. And I should really correct myself. I don't know for sure that Mayor Bloomberg's residence is more than 25,000 square feet. That example's really there so that you understand that a townhouse more than 3 stories is a commercial building, so you have to consider it in the commercial code. And I think we have one more example. I had a project where I was asked, does this project require daylight responsive dimming? This is the entry elevation for a building lobby with floor-to-ceiling glass, wall-to-wall glass. The daylight zone matching the height of the glazing would be 8 feet, 8 inches deep into the lobby. And this project, it had more than 150 watts in that daylight zone. So technically, this space would require daylight responsive dimming, but there's a canopy outside the door. And the canopy is the entire width of the doorway, and it projects 6 feet off of the building. So there's not going to be any daylight in this lobby. And currently, there's no exception for something like this. All of the obstructions in the code talk about the height of the obstruction in relationship to the setback from the building. Well, the canopy doesn't equate in those obstructions. So this is a place where the designer is going to have to submit with basically a variance saying, no, I didn't comply with all the code requirements, because there wouldn't be any energy savings if I put daylight responsive controls in this space. And it's a big problem. I think that the code requires canopies over entry doors in New York City. So it's really like every project. Right? And we have one other that we're not going to review, but it's in here for your reference. Did you want to? It's about roof monitors, and I have to tell you, in my opinion, roof monitors are the most complicated piece of the code because the obstructions are different, the way you measure it is different, and I have had 0 roof monitors in my 30 years of lighting design, so we just put it in here for some extra information for you. Thank you. Yes?
What happens if you have your daylight zones that you need to control separately from your general illumination? How, let's say you have a linear fixture that you basically cut in half, if it's your daylight zone or it's a track, how do you deal with that?
You cut it in half.
So that's a good reason to figure out the daylight zones before you do the lighting layout, and then try to plan accordingly with the fixture locations. But yeah, in a lot of situations, you might have to cut it.
Remember,
anyway.
it's about the wattage inside the zone, so it could affect, it really will affect your design. Are the lights perpendicular to the daylight zone instead of parallel to the daylight zone when it's linear? And the architecture might really want it to be perpendicular, and the controls might tell you to make them parallel.
And then, I mean, if you have say a cove going along the wall or something like that, if you say that it's decorative lighting, then you don't have to have it daylight controlled. So that's, you're not gonna have to cut like a decorative cove like that.
Thank you. Any more questions? Thank you very much.